All right, Rabbi, say good morning, good morning. Afreilach and Shushan Purim to everyone. Okay. Thank you. Hopefully everyone had a beautiful, beautiful, uplifting Yom Tiv. Now we have the great zechus to continue in our journey in Mesachas Yevamos together. So we'll begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsor for the month of Adar Beis, to thank Leah Sol for dedicating all of the shiurim and drashos this month in honor of all those who organized the beautiful, meaningful, and emotional groundbreaking. To thank our Week of Learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsor for the refuah sheleimah of Aharon Yosef ben Chana Miriam, and an zechus of a zivug for Rivka Rachael Batsheva Reena. And to thank Naftali Baila Langer as a zechus, dedicating this year as a Week of Learning as a zechus for refuah sheleimah for Rachael Aster Feygã. And with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, but some really beautiful and exceptional gemara. So we'll say today's daf is Yud Aleph. So we actually left off in kind of the middle of Amud Beis. We left off with a machlokes between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So we'll say, again, just very quickly outside, we're picking up my taimo, which is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, about 19 lines up from the bottom. What was the machlokes? The machlokes is in the following case. A man does chalitza. We'll just keep it easy. Right? There are 3 brothers, Reuven, Shimon, let's make it 4. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. So now Reuven passes away, and ultimately again he leaves 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. Shimon, his brother, goes ahead and does chalitza with Rachel. Then what happens? Shimon has a change of heart, and he decides that he wants to go ahead and remarry Rachel. So Rabbi says, so this is the machlokes case. The shayla, of course, now in this situation becomes, what is the level of liability? So we had a machlokes, Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish says that halacha l'maisa, Reuven, when he remarries the chalutza, ultimately is in violation of a lav, is in violation of a prohibition. If any other brother who were to remarry Rachel, ultimately again would have the chi of kares, and that would be the chi of kares of eshes ach. On the other hand, Reuven himself would, if he were to marry the co-wife, would have an Isser Kares on the co-wife, as of course with the other brothers as well. Rabbi Yochanan holds a little bit differently. Rabbi Yochanan holds that halacha l'maisa, once Reuven does chalitza, the entire situation has been downgraded to an Isser Lav, both for Reuven as well as the other brothers, and both for Rachel as well as for Leah. Beautiful. With that, let's begin. Says the Gemara, my time with Reish Lakish. So what's Reish Lakish's logic? Why does Reish Lakish hold this way? So Amar Kra Reish Lakish says like this: Asher lo yivna bayis. The pasuk says when speaking about chalitza, says that the chalitza process is done for the brother who will not rebuild or not build his deceased brother's home. Kevan shelo bana shelo yivna. Ultimately, again, the Torah says once the surviving brother chooses not to go ahead and do yibum, that's it. He's not allowed to change. In other words, we'll say once you do chalitza, there's no, as they say, backsies, right? You can't go ahead. That's it. You're done, right? You can't decide afterwards to go ahead and remarry this woman. Ihu hu dekai below yivne aval ochiv kidukaimu kaimu. So we'll say Reish Lakish's logic is like this: the only person who's downgraded to a lav of lo yivne is the brother who did chalitza. But the truth is, the other brothers who did not directly do chalitza, ultimately their relationship to the wives of their deceased brother is one of eshes ach, and therefore punishable by kares. Furthermore, again, the lav is only with the woman with whom he did chalitza. Tzara kidekaimi kaimi. The tzara ultimately again remains in the state of eshes ach. That's the position of Reish Lakish. So I'll say so again. Reish Lakish's position is that halacha l'maisa, the brother who does chalitza, his relationship with his sister-in-law is now downgraded to a lav. So should he transgress and remarry her, he's in violation of a lav. But that relationship is only with the woman with whom he did chalitza. The other sister-in-law with whom he didn't do chalitza is still an Isser Kares. Furthermore, the brother who did chalitza sees a downgrade in his relationship from an Isser Kares to a lav. The other brothers, still remain at the Isser Kares level. So we'll say, we'll frame them in a little bit sharper in just a moment. Rabbi Yochanan, on the other hand, says, Rabbi Yochanan, Mi'ika midi d'meikara, I by haichalas, vi by haichalas, vi by the haichalas, vi by the haichalas. So Rabbi Yochanan says, it doesn't make any sense. Remember, Rabbi say, who has the right to do chalitza? Who has the right to do chalitza? Who has the right to do chalitza? Any of the surviving brothers. Who do they have the right to do chalitza with? Either of the wives. So Rabbi Yochanan said, any brother has the same right. And the truth is, chalitza can be accomplished with any of the women, any of the wives. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, V'hashta kai ala b'karis. Suppose it doesn't make sense to say that after chalitza is done, there's still going to be an iser karis which remains intact. That doesn't make any sense. Ella ihu shlichusa da'achim ka'avid, ihi shlichusa d'tzara ka'avda. Rather, says Rabbi Yochanan, the brother who does chalitza, he's not acting on his own behalf. Whose behalf is he acting on? Behalf of all the brothers, right? And the woman with whom he does chalitza, she's acting on whose behalf, or she's representing who? All of the wives. So I will say, what comes out of here is something very interesting. What's the fundamental machlokes? The fundamental machlokes is, in our case, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, right? In our case, Ruvain passes away. Shimon does chalitza. So I will say, is Shimon, when Shimon does chalitza, is that his own personal act? Or ultimately, again, is that an act on behalf of all of his brothers? Similarly, when Rachael does chalitza, is that her own personal act, or is she representing all of the wives? That's effectively the machlokes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Reish Lakish is going to say, when Shimon does chalitza, that's him. That's his account. He's settling his account. The other brothers, kind of, they're included in his chalitza, but at the end of the day, they still have their own independent status. When Rachel does chalitza, that impacts her status, but the other co-wives' status still remains in the state of Eshes Ach. Rabbi Yochanan says, that's ridiculous. There is, right, Yibum chalitza Rabosai is a familial obligation. So when one brother acts, he's acting on behalf of who? His other brothers. Just like when one of the wives acts, she's acting on behalf of all of the wives. But say it's a fundamental, yisodistic, yibum chalitza mechanics discussion. It's really fascinating. So Rabbi Yochanan is the kasha to Reish Lakish. Hacholitz liyivim tov v'chazer v'kidsha umeis. So what's an interesting case? So let's say, same case, Ruvain, Shimon, Levi. What happens? Ruvain passes away. He has two wives, Rachel and Leah, and Rachel and Leah fall to the brothers. Shimon, surviving brother, does chalitza. We'll call with Rachel. They will say, then what happens? So now, so Cholitz leaving though, the chazer v'kidsha. They both say now, in this case, like we said before, what's Shimon doing? Shimon does chalitza, and then illegally goes ahead and what? Remarries his chalutza. Okay, it's a lav, right? It's not kares, it's a lav. What happens? Umeis. They both say now what happens? Shimon dies. And Shimon dies without what? Shimon dies without children. So both say, wow, what a case. Hey, so now Shimon dies without children. So both say, so now what's the shayla? So both say, so now Shimon's widow also happens to be who? Reuven's widow, right? Remember again, Shimon did chalitza with Reuven's wife, with Reuven's widow, right? Then he's not allowed to marry her, but he did remarry her. Shimon now also dies without children. Now, so we'll say, now what happens? Rachel, this same lady, now has fallen for Yibum a second time. So what's the halacha? Tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Ultimately, again, she requires chalitza from the brothers. So listen to what Rabbi Yochanan says. So Rabbi Yochanan says, this makes perfect sense to me. Why? Because at the end of the day, it was just an isser, it was just a lav. It was just a lav, right? That Shimon, the surviving brother, transgressed. Therefore, the marriage is a valid marriage, so that when Shimon now dies, Rachel falls before Yibum to the other brothers. This is why she requires chalitza. Ella ledidach, amai tzricha chalitza. But at the end of the day, according to you, right, this woman, Yevamos, listen to this, according to Reish Lakish, what's the status of Rachel? Yevamos, play this out. According to Reish Lakish, what's the status of Rachel? Eishes Ach. She's an Isser Kares. Why? Because remember again, according to Reish Lakish, only the brother who does chalitza downgrades the Eishes Ach relationship from Kares to a Lav. According to Reish Lakish, all of the other brothers at the end of the day still have an Isser Kares. So according to you, Reish Lakish, there should be no chalitza. And using this logic, Ema Seifa, Amad Echa Mina Achen V'Kidsha. But similarly again, look at the end of that Braisa. The end of the Braisa says if one of the brothers went ahead and was Makadesher. Now we'll say, now look at Rashi, 4 lines up from the bottom. Amad Echa Mina Achen V'Kidsha. Shlo Kidsha Acholitz Ela Echa Mina Achen. Abba said, listen to this. This case just keeps getting more exciting. It almost feels, it feels wrong how good it is, right? So listen to this case. So now, same case. Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. I just added in Yehuda. We don't need you. We'll keep him in there. Right? But what matters are the first 3. Reuven dies. 2 wives, Rachel and Leah. What happens? Shimon does chalitza with Rachel. Okay? The Seifa of the Brisa says like this. Let's say now, Levi comes along and does Kiddushin with Rachel. Remember again, Rachel is the woman with whom Shimon did chalitza. So now Levi, the 3rd brother, comes and is mekadesh Rachel. So watch this. This is incredible. Amar echa mina achan vekidsha ein la alav klum. Ultimately, I will say now ein la alav klum. Rashi says is the ein kiddushin tofsin la ba ve'ein tzricha himenu get the ein kiddushin. Let's listen to this. That marriage is halachically, what's the word? Irrelevant. In other words, the Kiddushin doesn't get off the ground. Why? Because let's listen to this. Levi's relationship to Rachel is an Isser Kares. And Kiddushin is not Tofsin in an Isser Kares. So we'll say, so this is actually very strange. So now it sounds like, from the first part of the Mishnah, that if you go ahead and do chalitza, one of the brothers remarries the chalitza, ultimately that's an Isser Lav, right? In the last part of the Brisa, sounds like it's an Isser Kares. V'chayve laveninu amai ein la alav klum. And if it's only chayve laven, if after chalitza is done, so Rachel only becomes chayve laven for all of the brothers, like Rabbi Yochanan is suggesting, then why would Kiddushin not be tov sin? To which the Gemara of Sheshes, Seif Asal Rabbi Akiva. Oh, watch this. The Sefer will say at the end of the Mishnah, or Bryce should say, goes according to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi will say Rabbi Akiva has one of the strictest halachas when it comes to Kiddushin, namely Da'amar, Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'chayve Lavin. We'll say Rabbi Akiva paskins the halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin is not Tovsin. Kiddushin does not take effect, even when the marriage is simply prohibited by a lav. So we'll say you could fill in the blank on that one, right? A Kohen marries a divorcee. That's a good case. He'll say, so ultimately, again, that's a lav. Everyone else holds that although ideally, of course, a marriage like this is not appropriate, but l'maisa, again, everyone else says it works. In other words, it's a kiddushin. Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion, he says, chayve lavin are just like chayve krisos, and halacha l'maisa kiddushin doesn't take effect. Well, if you're listening to the Rabbi Akiva, alav klum, why doesn't the Brisa just say that? And according to the words of Rabbi Akiva, ultimately kiddushin doesn't work. Top of Yud Aleph Rabosai, kasha. It's a good kasha. Rav Ashi look at Reish Lakish, Umataris look at Reb Shimon. So Rav Ashi holds like Reish Lakish. Rabosai in this machlokes Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabosai, understand we're still back with our credible machlokes. Are you so to stick machlokes? So Rabosai, let's just frame it again so that we're clear on it. Because actually what's very exciting today is we're going to do some halacha l'maisa, a little bit of halacha l'maisa. So I'll say, remember again, in this machlokes, here's what we have. We have Reuven, Shimon, Levi. Reuven has 2 wives, Rachel, Leah. Reuven dies. Rachel, Leah for Shimon, the surviving brother, does chalitza with Rachel. So Shabbos says, so now the shaila is, what has Shimon accomplished? So the way the Gemara chooses to measure this is by saying, let's say Shimon goes ahead and remarries Rachel. So Reish Lakish will say, Chalitza only has an impact on the brother who performed Chalitza and with the wife with whom he performed Chalitza. For those two, their relationship now, should they continue it, although it's illegal, is downgraded to a lav. Everyone else in this family chalent, right? Everyone else in this mix is still Eshazach, is an Isser Kares. So I'll say, which is incredible. So according to Reish Lakish, Chalitza only impacts the direct participants of the Chalitza and downgrades their relationship from an Isser Kares to an Isser Lav. Everyone else remains as was. Eshazach, Isser Kares. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, Chalitza is a family event. Once Chalitza is done, the entire family, the brothers, all of the widows, are downgraded from an Isser Kares to an Isser Lav. Chalitza is and essentially, I will say to frame it a little bit better, the one brother, Reish Lakish says the one brother is acting on his own. Right? It's his own chalitza. It's no one else's chalitza. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, one brother is acting on behalf of the mishpacha. Good. I will say it's very exciting. I can't just keep glancing over at the Rambam. I have to stay focused over here. We're gonna get to it in just a moment. Rav Ashi, have a look at Reish Lakish. We'll say first line Yud Aleph. Rav Ashi holds like Reish Lakish, umetaris like Rabbi Shimon, and he interprets like Rabbi Shimon. Again, we'll see that in just a moment. Ravina have a look at Rabbi Yochanan. Umetaris kirabanon. Ravina holds like Rabbi Yochanan and ultimately again interprets the Brisa like the Rabbanon. Rav Ashi so like Reish Lakish. Umetaris like Rabbi Shimon. So Rav Ashi holds like Reish Lakish in principle and interprets like Rabbi Shimon. I'll say, what does that mean? Here we go. Hacholes liyavinto v'chazer v'kidsha. If a man does chalitza with his sister-in-law, so we'll say same case. Reuben passes away, leaves behind Rachel and Leah. Shimon does chalitza with Rachel. So we'll say that should be the end of the story. But it's not. What happens? Chazer v'kidsha. Shimon now goes ahead and decides to remarry Rachel. Chazer v'kidsha. Tzricha chalitza min ha'achin. Ultimately, again, and I will say now the case over here, the Gemara doesn't say it, is that what happens? Shimon dies without children. So now Rachel falls to Levi and to Yehuda. Ultimately, again, she requires chalitza. Now I will say, the fact that we say she requires chalitza, what does that mean? What does that tell you? Right? That the marriage, Shimon did chalitza with Rachel, and although he should not have remarried her, because it's an Isser, right? It's a lav, nevertheless, if he did so what? It works. That's what we're focusing on. It works. We'll say, some things that are asr, you shouldn't do them, but if you do them, it works. Okay, so now what happens? So now when Shimon, who illegally married his chalutza, dies without children, his chalutza / widow is now subject to chalitza by the other brothers. So the Gemara says, Man achin. So who are these brothers? Achin hayilodim. Ultimately, again, they will say these must be brothers who were born after, listen to this, after Shimon went ahead and remarried his chalutza. This is great. After he remarried his chalutza. That will say, now why is that important? Look at Rashi. It's right across in Rashi. Hayilodim. Shenoldu achar kiddushin shel zeh. These are talking about brothers who were born after Shimon remarried his chalutza. After he remarried her. V'lo itzara alay bechalitza. So, dehazeka kamaisa lo ramai kamaihu. V'yabuim shum eshes achiv shelo hayaba'alam lo misra. Listen to this. Why? Now remember, we're setting this up as brothers who were born after Shimon remarried his chalutza. Now, what's the beauty of saying they were born after Shimon married his chalutza? What's the beauty of it? They have nothing to do with Reuven's original marriage to Rachel and Leah. Right? So we learned this. This is the case of non-contemporary brothers. Right? So this is even better. These brothers were born, Reuven, when were they born? After Reuven died, after Shimon did chalitza with Rachel, and after Shimon remarried Rachel. So by the time they came into this world, all they knew, so to speak, was what? Shimon was married to Rachel. There was no other baggage. They had no baggage. I will say, isn't part of the beauty of babies? Part of the beauty of babies is they have no baggage. Right? They have no baggage. So these babies have no halachic baggage. They come into the world, and ultimately, again, this was after Reuven passed away, after Chalitza happened, after the remarriage happened. So therefore, again, I will say, these brothers, when Shimon subsequently passes away, they're ultimately have a chiyuv in Chalitza / Yibum, because they have no previous relationship with Rachel through Reuven. So the Gemara says, Kiman, Kreb Shimon. Ultimately, again, I will say, whose opinion does this reflect? This is Reb Shimon. So the Gemara says, Amad Echa min hanoladim v'kidsha. So listen to this. What happens if halacha l'maisa noladim? Now, I will say, you'll notice the difference in lashon haber between yelodim and noladim. Yelodim refers ultimately to brothers who were born after Shimon went ahead and remarried his chalutza. Noladim refers to those who were born earlier, brothers who were alive at the time of the first chalitza. What happens? So I will say, so there are two sets of brothers in this mix over here. Let's say one of the brothers who was born during the chalitza, who was already alive at the time of the chalitza, goes ahead and is mekadesh Rachel. Ein la'alav klum. Ultimately, the marriage is ein la'alav klum. The marriage doesn't work. The kiddushin is not tofsin. The kiddushin doesn't take effect. Now watch this. Rashi says, Kireish Lakish. This reflects the view of Reish Lakish, who holds that halacha l'maisa, only the brother who did chalitza sees his relationship with his sister-in-law downgraded to a lav. Everyone else remains at an iser kares. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan. I'm sorry, Kiman Kireish Lakish. Ultimately, whose opinion does this reflect? Reish Lakish. Beautiful. Ravina says like Rabbi Yochanan tries like Ali Drabanan. So on the other hand, Ravina holds like Rabbi Yochanan, and he interprets this case like the Rabbanan. Here we go. If a man, again, about say same names, Shimon does chalitza with Rachel, and what happens? Then he decides to subsequently remarry her. Tzricha chalitza min ha'achim. She requires chalitza from the brothers. Now, Abba says Shimon dies without children. She requires chalitza from the brothers. Man achin, who are the brothers? Achin hanoladim. Ultimately, Abba says this refers to brothers who were alive at the time of the first chalitza. Kiman, whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Yochanan, like Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan holds that once one brother does chalitza, then what? All of the brothers are downgraded to a lav. Amar echan min hayilod in the kidsha. If one of the brothers who was born after Shimon's chalitza does kiddushin, ein la'alav klum. Ultimately, again, halacha l'maisa, there is no kiddushin there. There is no kiddushin there. Says the Gemara, kiman, kirabanan. Ultimately, again, like the Rabbanan. So the Gemara will say, good. So we'll say, so let me just tell you this halach. So we'll say, this brings to a close the sugya of Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. So we'll say, how do we paskin? This is incredibly important. How do we paskin? So we'll say, listen to this. This is the Rambam in Hilchos Yibum v'Chalitza, Perek Aleph, halacha tes. Here we go. So we'll say very, very, very important nekuda to remember. Somebody had many wives, right? And he died. Reuven, number of wives, and he dies. Bi'asa o chalitzasa shel achas mehen poteres es hashar ve'ino miyarim l'shtayim. Ultimately, we'll say halacha l'maisa. The Rambam says we paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. Very important. We pass like Rabbi Yochanan. I will say, first of all, what the Rambam is highlighting over here is actually something very important, which is that, number one, you only do Yibum and Chalitza with one wife, right? There's no such thing. You might never spell this out explicitly, but you never do. You're not allowed to go ahead and marry more than one of the widows. So Yibum or Chalitza is done with one wife. That's a piece of information too. Number two, only one brother has the right to do Yibum on behalf of the other brothers. And a piece of information number three is the Rambam paskins like Rabbi Yochanan. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, when one brother does chalitza on behalf of the brothers, let me say it differently. When one brother does chalitza, he is doing it on behalf of all of the brothers. That is being done on behalf of everyone. And the right that I will say is now the sister-in-law, in our case Rachel, is now downgraded to we'll call it the status of a chalutza. She is no longer called, quote unquote, Eshes Ach, and punishable by kares. But instead, if one of the brothers were to marry her, although it would be illegal, it would be a lav and not kares. Similarly, ultimately, the downgrading of that prohibition is not only upon the woman who actively participated in chalitza, but who else? Upon her co-wife as well. We'll say incredible. Absolutely incredible. So that is the position of Rabbi Yochanan, and that is how the Rambam paskins. Beautiful. Let's go weiter. Itmar. So we learned Haba'al Yevama Uba Echad Mina Achin Al Sarasa. So we'll say an interesting case here. What happens? Right. So we've got again Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda. Reuven has two wives, Rachel and Leah. Reuven passes away. So what happens afterwards? There's Rachel and Leah. So what occurs? Shimon goes ahead and does Habal Yivama. So Shimon does Yibum. So we'll say in this case over here, Shimon does Yibum with Rachel. And then what happens? Uba echad mina achin al sarasa. And I will say now an interesting case here. One of the other brothers ultimately again does Yibum with Leah. What's the halacha here? Pligi barav acha v'ravina. Chad amar bekares, v'chad amar ba'aseh. So Rabbi say here's the interesting discussion, right? So Rabbi say, so obviously the second brother, right? We'll call him Levi, did something wrong, right? Shimon decides to do Yibum, fantastic, right? At the end of the day now, Levi married a woman he's not allowed to marry. So the shaila just is, what's the nature of his prohibition? One opinion says kares. I gave this away a little bit. I jumped the gun on the Rambam. I just realized, okay, fine. From the expressions, it looks like you have no idea what I'm talking about. So good, we're fine. Okay, so I'll say, so listen to this. It's amazing. The eye contact is fantastic this morning. Right? So again, one opinion says that what Levi did is punishable by a lav. And one opinion says that what Levi did is punishable by kares. So we'll say, here we go. So pligi b'ravacha b'ravina. Chad amar b'kares, v'chad amar ba'aseh. Rather, we're going to say it's actually naseh pazik. Man damar b'kares kreish lakish, uman damar ba'aseh Rabbi Yochanan. Good, I will say. So again, we know already what the halach is in that case. We just saw it. We paskin that, remember again, Reuven passes away, leaves behind two wives, Rachel and Leah. When Shimon does, in this case, Shimon's doing Yibum with Rachel. At the point that Shimon does Yibum with Rachel, we'll say, who is Shimon on whose behalf is Shimon acting? Right? All the brothers. And ultimately, again, when Rachel does Yibum, on whose behalf is she acting? Right? All of the wives. Which technically means now we're done. In this case over here, Levi, another brother, decides to marry the other widow, Leah. So I will say, Mutar Aser, right? But again, we pass like Rabbi Yochanan, only a lav. Right? Only a lav, right? It's not going to be an Isser Kares or an Aseh, actually. Right? Alright, it's not going to be Kares because once Yibum is done, or Chalitza is done, it downgrades the entire relationship from an Isser Kares of Eshes Ach to ultimately, again, Chalutza. Incredible. We'll say, so that, I think, might be it's nice to kind of sink our teeth into a Rambam. So now we know Halacha L'Maisa again. We pass like Rabbi Yochanan. Weiter. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amarav. Tzaras Sota. But we actually saw this case alluded to a few blot ago. Tzaras Sota. So I will say, this is a great case. Tzaras Sota. The co-wife of a Sota. So I will say, if you take a look, well, for Tzaras Sota Asura. So Rav says, so let me clarify this. Look at Rashi. Second wide line in Rashi. Tzaras Sota Asura. Haya Nasui Beis Noshim. Reuven was married to two wives, Rachel and Leah. V'zinsa ha'achas tachtav. And I will say what happened. So Rachel committed adultery. She committed adultery. V'yesh Edim. And there are witnesses that she committed adultery. Umeis below bottom. I will say in this case over here, what happened? Reuven died without children. Okay, so now again, Reuven is married to two wives, Rachel and Leah. Rachel committed adultery, and this is a case where it's known. There's edus that she committed adultery. Reuven dies without children. So what's the halacha? Rashi says, "He v'tzaras sapaturos min af min achalitza my time tumak sibba finistra v'nikma." Both is fascinating. So in this case over here, when Reuven dies, there is no yibum or chalitza. there's no yibum or chalitza. When Reuven dies, ultimately, again, I will say what's happened. The mechanics over here is because there is no yibum or chalitza with the sota, she exempts her co-wife as well. Now, why is there no yibum or chalitza with a sota? I will say I want to just point out to you also just to avoid confusion, because I want to avoid confusion in Yevamos. I feel I've been incredibly successful with that so far. Let's say so again, chalutza is going to be used in two ways. Sota is going to be used in two ways. We colloquially use sota to describe what? A woman suspected of adultery. Here, the Gemara is going to use sota to refer to a woman who we know has committed adultery, and also we'll transition later on to suspected of adultery. Right now, here, it's again that she has committed adultery. So watch this. So why is she and her co-wife both from sota? Says from chalitza. Says the Gemara tumak sivba ka'arayos. So it's actually quite fascinating. The Torah uses the word tuma by a woman who has committed adultery in the same way that the Torah uses the word tuma by arayos. And the Gemara both sings something absolutely amazing. Saying the name of Rabbi, using the name of Rav. That the same way, they both say, right, we know this is, we start from the beginning. What's the halacha when a woman is in erva? Right, again, Reuven dies. Rachel and Leah fall to Yibum to Shimon. Rachel is Shimon's daughter. What's the halacha? No Yibum, and what? She exempts her co-wife. She exempts her tzara. So Rav is saying something amazing. They both say, by arayos it says tuma, by erva it says tuma, and now over here by sota, by adultery, it says tuma also. So therefore Rav is saying a woman who committed adultery essentially has the status of an erva, and therefore not only is she exempt from yibum or chalitza, but she exempts her co-wife as well. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Masir Rav Chisda, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Bi also chalitza same'achav sharishon poteres sarasa. Here I will say, here's the problem. Rabbi Shimon says that ultimately, again, either yibum or chalitza with this woman, which sounds like the sota, ultimately, again, will exempt her co-wife. So I will say, what does that sound like? Now, first, I'll take a look at Rashi. Just to understand, this is actually talking about a different kind of case, which is also quite fascinating. Biasa chalitza, so Rashi says, listen to this. Ha'isha shalach baila medina sayam. It's about a woman whose husband went overseas. Right? So Rachel and Leah are married to Reuven. Reuven goes overseas on a business trip. Ubal v'amrula meis ba'alech. And what happens? Witnesses come along and they say, by the way, Reuven died overseas. V'nises, so Rachel goes out and marries someone else. Right? Not Reuven's brother per se. We'll just call it Yisachar. She goes to marry Yisachar. V'achar kach ba baila. And then, surprise, her husband comes home. Right? So it turns out Reuven wasn't dead. Right? Reuven wasn't dead, he comes home. So we'll say, what happens? V'achar bala. So ba baila. So teitze mizeh. So we'll say, here's the problem. Now, she committed adultery. Now, granted, it wasn't intentional adultery. She thought that her husband was dead, right? And Lamaisa, again, there were Eidim that said that her husband was dead, right? So ultimately, but yet, de facto, she committed adultery. So because of that, she can't live with Reuven, nor can she live with Yisachar, right? Because she's committed adultery. To which the Gemara says, now watch the twist in this case. Watch the twist in this case. The Gemara says, "Mesu achav shelzeh ve'achav shelzeh." What happens if either Reuven, husband number one, or Yisachar, husband number two, die without children? So we'll say, so now technically she falls to yibum. What's the halacha? Choltzin v'lo miyabmin. We do chalitza and not yibum. Chalitza, not yibum. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Asa chalitzasa me'achav shal rishon poteres hi lechatchila as tzarasa. And Rabbi Shimon says that either again if yibum or chalitza is done, ultimately again it will exempt the brothers of the first husband. So the Gemara says, now what do we see? The poteres hi lechatchila as tzarasa sharihi kishar nashim legabe yavam tilo kansur rabana miyavam devadai sharia leishanu saisa. Rabbi say, now listen to this. Comes along Reb Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon says as follows. He says that halacha l'maisa, see Rabbi say this isn't a real adultery case. Right? Because remember again, this woman acted in good faith. Right? She thought that her husband was dead, so she remarried. So Chazal come along and penalize her and say you have to leave both marriages. Why do we tell you have to leave both marriages? In order to encourage women to be explicitly meticulous in researching the testimony that says that your husband is dead. But interestingly enough, from a Yibum perspective, when Reuven, her first husband, dies without children, we will make her subject to Yibum. Because at the end of the day, I will say, she really is still married to Reuven, right? That was a legal marriage. And the fact that she inadvertently had relations with Yisachar because she thought she was married to Yisachar because Reuven was dead, biblically, or at least Yibum-wise, we don't penalize her. So says the Gemara. So we'll say that seems to indicate that halacha. Now that's a case of a sota. That's a case of a woman who committed adultery, and yet halacha lamaisa she's still subject to Yibum. Aminu lacha ana sota da'araisa. Va'at amrit li sota d'Rabbanan. So I don't understand. I'm talking to you about a sota d'Oraisa. We'll say sota d'Oraisa means a woman who really committed adultery. Don't bring up this case. We'll say which is not a case of real adultery. The karila my karila. So why do we bring it up? So the Gemara says, "Kasavar called the tikkun Rabbani came d'Oraisa tikkun." He brought up this case because he figured, you know what? Any time that the Rabbanon go ahead and bring up a case, they kind of try to establish it as a d'Oraisa. So we'll say. So it turns out again. Just want to point out now. This case of Shama Shemis Baila Dinas Hayam, where she sees that her husband, or she gets testimony that her husband died overseas. As a result of it, she marries Yisachar. Turns out Reuven comes back. So the din d'Rabbanan is Teitzei Mizeh Mizeh. Both say, what's the din d'Oraisa? What's the real halacha? Right? When Reuven comes back, what's her status? What's Rachel's status? Right? She can remain married to Reuven. Right? They both say it's no different than Chas Hashem, a woman who was violated. Right? Again, she's still permitted to her husband. So this is a case of it wasn't violation, but she acted in good faith with information. She's permitted to go back to her husband. The rabbis tell her, Teitzim Mizeh Mizeh. No, we don't want people playing games. Leave both. What the Gemara is pointing out, by the way, should Reuven die without children, right before he's given her a get, halach l'maisa, she's subject to Yibum. To which the Gemara says, whoa, two different conversations. We're talking about a case where Reuven's married to Rachel and Leah. Rachel committed adultery. So the Gemara is teaching me that if Reuven dies without children, the fact that Rachel committed adultery, she's exempt from Yibum and she exempts her co-wife. Why? Because adultery and erva have the same word tumah written by both of them. So we treat adultery like an erva. Incredible. Says the Gemara, Maser Ravashi, Nichnasa imo l'seitzer v'shasa imo kidei tumah. If halach l'maisa, talking about now a classic sota case. Then what happens? Then halacha l'maisa, a woman goes ahead and is alone with a man in a private place long enough for an act of relations to occur. Asur l'beisa, v'asur l'truma. So we'll say this is the typical sota case, right? There's more to this, right? The husband warned his wife, don't be alone with this man, right? All of the different details that go into sota. So now what happens, right? She says to him, right? Husband gives her warning in front of two witnesses, and I want you to be alone with Ploni. Then she violates the warning. She's alone with him. And she's alone with him in a secluded place long enough for an act of adultery to have occurred. What's the halacha? Asur l'beisa. Number one, she's prohibited to her husband until she drinks the waters of the sota. Number two, if he's a Kohen, she can't eat truma. Number three, the imes choletzes below misyabemes. Wow. We'll say, and now halacha l'maisa what? What do you see from here? If Reuven were to die before the sota process is given the opportunity to unfold, what's the halacha? She does chalitza. So we'll say, what do you see from here? That halacha l'maisa, so even a sota, right? Even a sota is subject to the chalitza requirement, or I should say chalitza / yibum. Amalacharav amina lacha ana sota vadai. Va'at amritli sota suffix. Stop it, Rav says already. Just stop it. You're bringing up cases that are not the same case. Rav says, that's why I said before that we're using the word sota is used in so many different contexts. Rav says, I'm talking about a woman who definitely committed adultery. In the case you just mentioned, did the woman definitely commit adultery? No. There's what's called what? Raglayim l'davar. Raglayim l'davar means circumstantial evidence. Right? It looks a little strange. Right? It looks a little strange. But Lamaisa, Rav says, that's not the case. Rav is saying about a very specific case where we know Rachel committed adultery. Hineni muchana mazuman. Right? To go ahead and commit the Aveira of adultery. We know she did it in front of witnesses. It's clear. Right? That's the case Rav says where I'm saying that because it says tuma by adultery, it says tuma by erba, that just like erba is exempt from yibum in its entirety, and also exempts her co-wife, so to the woman who definitely committed adultery. I'll admit that in the case where it's a safek, of course you'll do chalitza in that case. So the Gemara says, Umayshna sota vandai. Why is a woman who definitely committed adultery different? Mishum d'chsiv ba tuma. Because the Torah used the word tuma. I sota safek nami tuma ksiva ba. But the Torah uses the word tuma. By a sota safek as well, safek sota as well. To which the Gemara says, Desanya Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar Omer Rabosai. If this is all about gzeira shava of tuma, it says tuma by adultery, and it says tuma by arayos. So when I say just like arayos, a woman who's in erva is exempt from yibum and exempts her co-wife. So too again, a woman who committed adultery is exempt from yibum and exempts her co-wife. But one second, the Torah says the words tuma even by what? Suffix sota. Even by a woman who may have committed adultery, and we have circumstantial evidence to that. After all, the Gemara says, Desanya, Rabbi Yosef ben Kipar Omer Mishum Rabbi Lazar, Hamachzir Grusha Samin Anisuin Asura. But listen to this case. This is talking about, switching gears again. This is talking about a case where a man divorced his wife, she married someone else, and ultimately again, then she divorces that man. Right? She divorces that man. Ultimately, Mishinisis la'achar umeis o girsha. So we'll say, the point is, Reuven was married to Rachel, non-Yibum case. Reuven's married to Rachel, they divorce. Rachel goes in and marries Shimon, unrelated, right? Nisuin. And then what happens? Either Shimon divorces her or dies, and now Reuven remarries her. Now that is illegal. Right? The Machzir Gushas Min Nisuin, Asura. Ultimately, again, this is Asr. So the Gemara says, Erusin Mutarin. Interestingly enough, if all Rachel had with Shimon, the second husband, was Erusin, not Nisuin, which presumably means what? They did not live together as husband and wife. Ultimately, again, with the fact that Reuven remarries her as mutter. Shnei Amar, Acharei Asher Hutam'a. The pasuk says, after she has become Tameh. So as I say, interestingly enough, the Torah uses the lashon of Tuma by Machzir Grushasu as well, by remarrying your divorcee. The Chum say Achazu va'achas zu asura. The Chum say the truth is whether Rachel married Shimon and it was Erusin or Nisuin, both are going to be asur. Elamani mekayim acharei hutam'a. So we'll say what is acharei hutam'a, which sounds like again that there's an act of relations that's occurring. Nisuin, what is that talking about? L'rabos sota shenistera. This comes to include what? This comes to include sota. Ultimately, again, who was secluded. The Rabbi say, interestingly enough, the Sota, who violated her husband's warning and was alone with that man who she was warned about long enough for something to occur, the Torah calls her Asher Hutama, Acharei Hutama. The Torah goes ahead and gives her the status of Tameya, which once again sounds like that halacha l'maisa, if we're going to go ahead and preclude a woman who committed adultery, ultimately again from engaging in yibum or chalitza, because of tuma gzeira shava to erva, to arayas, to erva, right? So even the suspected sota should be the same. Umay nistera. So to which the Gemara says, what does nistera mean? Nivala. It's talking about a case where no, she actually committed adultery. So the Gemara says, by my karla nistera. So why does it call it nistera? Nistera means alone. To which the Gemara says, lishna ma'al yunakit. The Gemara just wants to use a nicer lashon. So the Gemara says, Nivala, Tuma Behedrik Sibba. They say at the end of the day, if the Sota committed adultery, so that ultimately, again, the Torah says explicitly, Tuma, V'nistera v'hi nitma. Pasuk says she was alone with the man and she became defiled. L'meikum Allah belav. Ultimately, to tell you that halach l'maisef, her husband, were to now have relations with her after she committed adultery, he would be in violation of Allah. Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar, lab bisota lesle. So to which the Gemara says, Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar, lav bisota lesle. Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar holds that there's no lav by sota. Fafilu zanoi nami. The truth is, even Allah chalamais, it's not even znus. My timer, what's the reason? Havia v'ishus ksibba. This is actually very interesting. Rabbi Yossi ben Kipar holds that if a man were to have relations with his wife who had committed adultery, there's not even an isser, there's not even a lav. There's not even a lav. Why is that? Because the Torah still calls this woman his wife even after the act of adultery. Okay, let's get ready for this. So now what happens? Right, let's go back to our brothers. Right, Reuben, Shimon, Levi. Reuben has two wives, Rachel and Leah. What happens? Reuben divorces Rachel. He divorces her. Rachel goes and marries another man. Second marriage doesn't work out. Reuben remarries Rachel. Both say, Mutter Aser, Mutter Aser. Now what happens? Reuben dies without children. So what's the halacha? Mahu. Shabbos says, now what's the shaila? So the shaila is, what's Rachel's status? Lagabi Yibum, and what's Leah? Remember again, Rachel is a co-wife. So what's their status? Alibud Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur loti bailacha. According to Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur, there's not a shaila. Kevad no Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur. Tuma b'maxer gushaso udiksiva. Tzarasa kimosa. Shabbos says, according to Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur, the Torah used lashon of tuma. Ultimately, again, by maxer gushaso, by remarrying your divorcee. It says tuma by maxer gushaso. It says tuma by erva, which teaches me that what? That halacha l'maisa, again, they're exempt from yibum, and the co-wife is exempt as well. We'll say anytime you see tuma makes you just like an erva. So the Gemara says, v'imi shum, I'm sorry. So, Damar Rabbi Zin Kir, tuma by maxer gushaso, diksiva tzarasa kimosa. V'imi shum diksiv v'to'iva hi to'iva ve'im baneha tovin hat sarasa to'iva. So I will say, ultimately again, Salach Kort Rabbi Silber Kippur, it's clear, both the Maxir Grushasa wife is exempt from Yibum, and she exempts her co-wife as well. Even though it says to'iva, in other words, the only issue of Maxir Grushasa is the offspring of that union will not be negatively impacted. Kiti Bailacha, where does the kasha come up? Alibu de Rabbanon. According to the Rabbanon, Afagab Dam Rabbanon Tuma Besodahu Dichsiv. Even though again, halacha l'maisa, it says tuma by sota. So sorry, tuma by sota. We'll say, remember the Rabbanan darshan that the tuma by maxer grushaso is in fact ultimately again a reference to sota, not maxer grushaso. Nevertheless, pshuto halacha l'maisa. Still, we should apply the word tuma to maxer grushaso, and therefore say that she's treated like an erva. O dilma kevan di iaker, or perhaps we say that halacha l'maisa. No. Once you take out tuma in the pasuk of Maxir Grushaso and say that it applies to sota and not Maxir Grushaso, then halacha l'maisa, perhaps again the din of tuma doesn't apply to her, and therefore again, it should be mutter. Ikedan will say so again. There's an alternate version of this. According to the Rabbanan, it's not a kasha. Kevan de'is aker iaker. Once ultimately, again, it was uprooted. Once tuma was taken out of the context of Maxir Gushaso and applied to Sota, it's out. Kiti Baila Libud Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur. So, Mike, what's the halacha? Afagab Rabbi Yosef ben Kippur, Tuma Maxir Gushaso Diksiva. Even though the Torah says Tuma by Maxir Gushaso, nevertheless, Miyet Rachmana Hi To'iva Ve'in Sarasa To'iva. Does the Tuma status only apply to the Maxir Grishasa herself, and perhaps not by what? Not by Halacha L'maisa again, her Tzara. O Dilma, Hito Iva Ve'in Baneha Tovin, Hatzara Sateva. No, maybe Halacha L'maisa, the offspring is not impacted. But Halacha L'maisa, again, I should say differently. The offspring is not impacted, but the co-wife is. So we'll say, very simple kasha. Right, again, Reuben divorced Rachel. Reuben married to two wives, Rachel and Leah. We'll go one more minute. Reuben was married to two wives, Rachel and Leah. Reuben divorced Rachel. Rachel went and married another man. Complete marriage, gets divorced from that man. Reuben remarries Rachel. Illegal relationship. Now Reuben dies without children. So we'll say, what's the shaila? What's the status of Rachel and Leah for Yibum? Right? Essentially, again, I will say, so again, now she's a Maxir Gushaso. Is she chayaves in Yibum? What happens with her co-wife? I'm related to Nisua. We learned this. Haisa achas kshera. So we'll say, you know what? We'll stop over here. I'm leaving you mid-question. We'll say, I'll pick up over here. So again, that's going to be the shaila we're leaving off with. We paskin like Rabbi Yochanan. Leave off the case of Maxir Gushaso. What's the status ultimately, again, of her and of her co-wife? To be continued, we'll say, shkoyach.
sisters making the bus mitzvah or mitzvah. So that'll be more of the occasions after party.